December 7th, 1944. A starving German prisoner of war sat in an American camp, watching his captors throw away more food in one day than his family had seen in months, when he realized something that would shatter everything he believed about who was winning this war. What he discovered wasn't just abundant meals or modern factories, but 33 hidden advantages so overwhelming that Germany's defeat was inevitable from the very first day. Advantages that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. But here's what will blow your mind. If these 33 reasons were so obvious to a broken prisoner, why did it take the German High Command 4 more years to see what he figured out in 4 weeks? December 7th, 1944. The same date 3 years earlier when Pearl Harbor burned. But Hans Muller had no time to think about anniversaries as machine gun bullets whined past his helmet. The 22-year-old Wehrmacht soldier pressed his face into the frozen mud of a Normandy hedgerow, watching his squad leader's body twitch in the crater ahead. Blood mixed with December rain, turning the French soil into red paste that stuck to his boots like guilt. Hans had grown up believing Germany was the strongest nation on earth. His teachers in Bavaria told him so, every day for 12 years. The Hitler youth camps taught him that Germans were superior to all other races. American soldiers were weak city boys who would break at the first sign of real fighting. Jews and communists had infected America with their poison, making the country soft and decadent. German engineering, German discipline, German blood would triumph over the mongrel democracy across the Atlantic. But the American shells falling around him didn't seem to know they were supposed to be inferior. Each explosion shook the ground like an earthquake. The Americans had so many bullets they fired them like rain. Hans counted 40 enemy planes in one morning, while he hadn't seen a German fighter in 3 days. His rifle held 5 rounds. The Americans seemed to have unlimited ammunition for their 8-shot rifles that fired as fast as machine guns. The propaganda posters back home showed fat American capitalists cowering behind bags of money, while brave German soldiers marched to victory. Hans remembered those bright colors on classroom walls, the confident faces of German heroes, the promises that the war would be over by Christmas 1942, then Christmas 1943. Now, Christmas 1944 was 1 week away, and Hans was eating frozen potato peels for breakfast, while American artillery turned his world into a constant earthquake. His stomach hadn't been full in 8 months. The bread ration had shrunk to 2 slices per day. His younger sister wrote letters describing how she traded her school books for turnips. His mother mentioned that Frau Weber down the street had collapsed from hunger while standing in the food line. But Germany was winning, the radio assured them. The wonder weapons would arrive soon. Victory was certain. The American voices grew closer. Hans could hear them talking and even laughing between the explosions. They sounded relaxed, like farmers discussing the weather. One voice carried a thick accent that reminded Hans of his grandfather, who had emigrated to America before Hans was born. These enemy soldiers didn't sound desperate or afraid. They sounded like men who expected to go home soon. When the white phosphorus shell landed 10 meters away, Hans felt the heat sear his face even through his helmet. The chemical smoke burned his lungs and made his eyes stream. He stumbled backward, tripped over a fallen tree, and rolled into a shell crater where 2 American soldiers waited with their rifles pointed at his chest. Hans raised his hands, expecting the bullets that would end his war. The propaganda ministry had warned that Americans tortured prisoners before executing them. Jews in American uniforms would take special pleasure in murdering German soldiers. These 2 Americans looked young, maybe 18 years old, with clean uniforms and full cheeks that spoke of regular meals. "Kamerad," Hans whispered, using the universal word of surrender. The first American, a redhead with freckles, lowered his rifle and said something to his companion. The second soldier, darker-skinned with kind eyes, pulled out a small metal container and offered it to Hans. Inside were white tablets that dissolved on his tongue with the sweetness of sugar. The American pointed to his own mouth and made drinking motions. Water purification tablets. These enemy soldiers were giving him clean water. The redhead opened a small package wrapped in brown paper and handed Hans a rectangular bar. Chocolate. Real chocolate, dark and rich, melting on his tongue like a memory of peacetime. Hans hadn't tasted chocolate in 2 years. His captors were eating it like everyday food. They walked him back through their lines, past supply trucks that stretched to the horizon. Hans counted more vehicles in one American convoy than he had seen in the entire German army since 1943. Trucks loaded with ammunition boxes, fuel cans, food containers, medical supplies, and equipment he couldn't identify. Steam rose from mobile kitchens, serving hot meals to soldiers who complained about the cold coffee. The American soldiers guarding him wore thick winter coats that looked new. Their boots had no holes. Their rifles gleamed with fresh oil. They moved with the confidence of men who knew their next meal was guaranteed and their ammunition would never run out. At the prisoner collection point, Hans saw 30 German soldiers sitting in a circle, sharing American cigarettes and canned meat. A medic with a red cross on his helmet was bandaging the wounded leg of an SS officer who had spent 4 years teaching Hans that Americans were subhuman degenerates. The same SS officer who now accepted morphine from an American Jewish medic without protest. Hans stared at the medical tent, where American doctors worked on German and American wounded side by side. He watched American soldiers sharing their rations with prisoners who had been shooting at them an hour earlier. He saw supply trucks arriving with more food and medicine than his entire division had possessed in 6 months. Something was very wrong with everything he had been taught. Or something was very wrong with everything he was seeing. The cognitive dissonance made his head spin worse than the hunger that had become his constant companion. As they loaded him onto a truck heading west, Hans caught his first glimpse of what lay ahead, but he couldn't yet imagine how thoroughly his understanding of the world would shatter in the weeks to come. The transport ship smelled like fresh paint and disinfectant, instead of the rust and decay Hans expected from enemy vessels. Through the porthole, he watched New York Harbor emerge from the morning fog like a vision from another planet. Buildings stretched toward the sky higher than mountains, their windows catching sunlight like a million diamonds. Ships filled the harbor so densely that Hans lost count after 200. Smoke poured from countless factories along the shoreline. But this wasn't the black smoke of destruction he knew from bombed German cities. This was the white steam of production, of a nation building instead of burning. The Statue of Liberty stood in the harbor, holding her torch above waters that carried no floating debris, no oil slicks, no evidence of war. Hans had seen pictures of this statue in propaganda films that mocked American weakness, but the green giant rising from the sea looked anything but weak. She looked eternal, untouchable, like someone who had never doubted she would still be standing when this war ended. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, German prisoners lined up for processing, while American workers loaded ships with supplies heading back to Europe. Hans watched crates marked with familiar German city names pass by on conveyor belts operated by women in clean factory uniforms. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich. These American women were packing food and medicine for German civilians, while their own sons fought German soldiers overseas. The train ride to Kansas took 3 days, and Hans pressed his face to the window for every mile. Farmhouses dotted the landscape like toys scattered by a giant child, each one larger than the mayor's house in his Bavarian village. Barns rose from wheat fields that stretched beyond the horizon, their red roofs bright against golden grain that had escaped the harvest. Cattle grazed in pastures so vast that Hans couldn't see their boundaries. At every train station, American families waited with suitcases and smiled while hugging soldiers heading home on leave. Children ran alongside the train, waving at the German prisoners, not with hatred, but with curiosity. An elderly woman in Illinois threw apples through the train windows, and when Hans bit into the sweet fruit, juice ran down his chin like tears. Camp Concordia. Kansas sat in the middle of wheat fields that rolled toward every horizon like a golden ocean. The camp gates opened to reveal barracks that looked more like the youth hostels Hans remembered from peacetime hiking trips. Each building had electric lights, running water, and heating systems that kept the December cold at bay. The German prisoners walking between buildings wore clean uniforms and had gained weight since their capture. The mess hall served Hans his first American dinner on metal trays divided into sections like a child's plate. Mashed potatoes filled one section, green beans another, and a piece of beef larger than any meat he had seen since 1941 occupied the center. White bread, real butter, and whole milk accompanied the meal. The American guards ate the same food from identical trays at tables scattered throughout the same room. Hans calculated the calories on his plate. Over 3,000, more than his family's combined daily ration back home. And this was just dinner. Breakfast had included eggs, bacon, pancakes, and orange juice. Lunch brought soup, sandwiches, fruit, and cake. The American prison camp was feeding German soldiers better than Germany fed its own civilians. A prisoner named Klaus, who had arrived 6 months earlier, showed Hans around the camp after dinner. The library contained thousands of books in German and English, including American newspapers that arrived daily. The workshop hummed with machinery that German factories would have treasured. Prisoners built furniture, repaired equipment, and learned trades that would serve them after the war ended. Sunday afternoon brought the ice cream truck, a white vehicle with bells that played music like a church carnival. The driver, an elderly American man who spoke broken German, served vanilla ice cream in paper cups to any prisoner who wanted some. Hans had forgotten ice cream existed. The cold sweetness on his tongue triggered memories of childhood summers before the war consumed everything sweet in his life. The camp store sold items that German civilians hadn't seen in years. Coca-Cola in green bottles, chocolate bars wrapped in silver paper, cigarettes, soap that smelled like flowers, and magazines filled with pictures of American life. Prisoners earned camp money by working in the fields or workshops, then spent it on luxuries that their families at home could only dream about. Hans wrote his first letter home on American paper with an American pencil, trying to describe what he was experiencing without triggering the censor's scissors. How could he explain that his captors fed him 3 meals a day plus snacks, that the prison camp had hot showers, clean laundry, and a hospital better equipped than the one in his hometown, that American farmers hired German prisoners as workers and paid them fair wages for harvesting crops? The cognitive dissonance grew stronger each day. German radio broadcasts that reached the camp spoke of American cities in ruins, of a decadent nation collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. But Hans could see American prosperity in every truck that delivered supplies, every airplane that flew overhead, every meal that arrived precisely on schedule. At night, lying on a mattress with clean sheets and warm blankets, Hans stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he was experiencing with everything he had believed about America. The Americans weren't starving. They weren't weak. They weren't collapsing. They were winning with such overwhelming abundance that they could afford to feed their enemies better than Germany fed its friends. Something fundamental about his understanding of the world was about to break completely. Thanksgiving morning arrived with frost covering the Kansas wheat fields like powdered sugar on a cake. Hans woke to the smell of roasting turkey drifting through the barracks windows, a scent so rich and unfamiliar that it made his stomach growl despite the generous breakfast he had eaten 2 hours earlier. American holidays meant nothing to him. But the other prisoners were whispering excitedly about the feast the guards had promised. The mess hall had been decorated with orange and brown paper, cut into the shapes of leaves. Long tables covered with white cloth stretched across the room, set with real plates instead of the usual metal trays. Hans took his seat next to Klaus, who had been imprisoned long enough to experience this ritual before. American guards sat at the same tables as the German prisoners, removing their helmets and setting aside their weapons like dinner guests in a family home. Camp Commandant Colonel Morrison stood at the front of the room, his gray hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. He spoke in careful German, explaining that Thanksgiving was America's harvest celebration, a time to give thanks for abundance and share food with everyone at the table, even enemies. Hans wondered if this was another form of psychological warfare, but the smell of sage and butter made it hard to maintain suspicion. The kitchen doors opened like theater curtains, revealing the most magnificent sight Hans had witnessed since childhood Christmas mornings. American cooks wheeled out carts loaded with golden turkeys that glistened under the electric lights. Each bird was larger than any chicken Hans had seen, surrounded by mountains of stuffing that smelled like herbs from heaven. Mashed potatoes arrived in serving bowls the size of wash basins, accompanied by gravy boats that could have floated toy ships. Hans counted 12 different dishes on his table alone. Sweet potatoes covered with melted marshmallows that looked like clouds. Green beans mixed with slivered almonds. Cranberry sauce the color of rubies. Dinner rolls so soft they collapsed under the weight of real butter. Corn prepared 3 different ways. Salads made from vegetables that German civilians hadn't seen since before the war started. The American guard sitting across from Hans, a farm boy named Jimmy from Iowa, piled food onto Hans's plate until it threatened to overflow. Jimmy's own plate held identical portions, and he ate with the casual manner of someone who expected such abundance every day of his life. This wasn't a special meal for the Americans. This was normal Thursday dinner, elevated slightly for the holiday. Hans cut into the turkey and watched steam rise from meat so tender it fell apart under his fork. The first bite triggered taste memories he thought the war had erased forever. His grandmother's Sunday dinners, his mother's birthday celebrations, Christmas Eve feasts from a world that no longer existed. Tears ran down his cheeks, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. Jimmy noticed Hans's reaction and spoke in broken German mixed with English. His family raised turkeys on their Iowa farm, he explained. This year, they had sent 3,000 birds to feed soldiers and prisoners across Kansas. Jimmy's two brothers were fighting in Europe while he guarded German prisoners in America, but his family still cooked Thanksgiving dinner for their enemies because that's what Americans did. The cognitive dissonance that had been building for months finally cracked Hans's worldview like an egg hitting concrete. America was feeding its enemies better than Germany fed its allies. American prison camps offered luxuries that German civilians hadn't seen in years. American soldiers shared their food, their cigarettes, their medicine with the same men who had been shooting at them weeks earlier. Hans pulled out the small notebook the camp had provided for letter writing and began recording his thoughts in pencil. How can our enemies live better than our friends? How can their prisoners eat better than our civilians? If America is weak and decadent, why do they have so much food that they give it to people trying to kill them? That evening, Hans attended the camp's educational program for the first time. Professor Weber, a German-American who had emigrated to Kansas in 1925, taught basic American history to prisoners preparing for post-war life. Weber explained how America's abundance came from systems rather than accidents, free markets that rewarded innovation, democratic debate that prevented catastrophic mistakes, immigration that brought the world's best ideas to American shores. Weber showed photographs of his own journey from Germany to Kansas, describing how he had arrived with nothing but borrowed money and determination. Now he owned a wheat farm that produced more grain than entire German villages. America hadn't given him this prosperity. America had given him the freedom to earn it through his own efforts. Hans thought about his father, who had worked the same small plot of Bavarian soil for 40 years without ever owning it. About his sister, whose intelligence meant nothing because she was born female in a system that valued only obedience. About his own future, which had never extended beyond following orders until the day he died, in service to the state. Late that night, Hans wrote in his diary with handwriting that grew steadier as his thoughts crystallized. I came here believing Germany was strong and America was weak. Now I see that Germany is strong at breaking things, but America is strong at building things. Germany teaches people to obey. America teaches people to think. Germany makes people afraid of their government. America makes the government afraid of its people. The ideological prison that had contained Hans's mind for 22 years finally collapsed completely, leaving him free to see the world as it actually existed, rather than as he had been told it should exist. The train carrying Hans back to Germany in June 1946 moved through landscapes that looked like photographs of the moon. Cities that once held millions of people now consisted of rubble piles separated by narrow paths where survivors picked through debris like scavengers. Dresden passed by the window as a collection of broken walls and twisted metal, its famous church reduced to a pile of stones that would take decades to rebuild. Hans pressed his face against the glass and tried to reconcile this wasteland with the abundant Kansas farmlands he had left behind. His duffel bag contained soap, chocolate, cigarettes, and canned food that American families had sent to German prisoners. These gifts felt heavier than gold as the train approached his hometown, where smoke still rose from ruins that had been burning on and off since 1943. The Bavarian village where Hans had grown up looked like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. Every third house stood as a hollow shell, with empty windows staring at nothing. The church tower had collapsed into the cemetery, mixing gravestones with bell fragments in a sculpture of defeat. His own family's house survived, but the roof had been patched with scraps of metal and wood that didn't match the original tiles. His mother answered the door wearing a dress made from curtain fabric, her face so thin that her cheekbones cast shadows in the afternoon light. She hugged him with arms that felt like bird wings, and he could count her ribs through the threadbare cloth. His sister Maria had grown 3 inches taller but lost 20 pounds, her school dress hanging loose like a scarecrow's clothing. Hans emptied his duffel bag onto the kitchen table, watching his family's eyes widen at treasures they hadn't seen since before the war. Real soap that smelled like flowers, chocolate bars wrapped in silver paper, cigarettes that could be traded for bread, canned meat that would feed them for a week. His mother picked up a bar of soap and held it like a holy relic, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. The contrast between American abundance and German devastation hit Hans like a physical blow to his chest. He had gained 15 pounds in American captivity, while his family had slowly starved. American guards had complained about cold coffee while his sister traded school books for turnip scraps. American prisoners received care packages from strangers, while German civilians ate grass soup and called it dinner. Hans spent his first week home walking through the ruins of his childhood, trying to explain to neighbors what he had experienced in America. They listened with the polite attention of people hearing fairy tales, nodding at descriptions of ice cream trucks and Thanksgiving dinners that sounded too fantastic to believe. How could the enemy nation live in such plenty while the master race picked through garbage for food? Old Herr Kruger, who had lost 3 sons on the Eastern Front, shook his head when Hans described American prison camps with libraries and workshops. "You are confused, boy. The Americans must have drugged you or used some kind of trick. Germany is the greatest nation on earth. Our leaders wouldn't have lied to us about something so important." But Hans had seen the truth with his own eyes, tasted it with his own tongue, lived it with his own body. America hadn't won the war through superior weapons or better soldiers. America had won through superior systems that produced abundance instead of scarcity, innovation instead of obedience, hope instead of fear. Hans began teaching English to local children, using textbooks that American aid organizations shipped to German schools. He told stories of American farmers who hired German prisoners and treated them like family members, of American doctors who operated on German wounded with the same care they gave American patients, of American families who sent Christmas packages to enemy soldiers because kindness was stronger than hatred. In the evenings, Hans wrote letters to Jimmy Morrison, the Iowa farm boy who had shared Thanksgiving dinner with him in Kansas. Jimmy wrote back describing the 1946 harvest, which produced so much grain that America was shipping surplus wheat to feed German civilians. The same farms that had fed German prisoners were now feeding German families, because America had enough abundance to feed both friends and former enemies. The realization struck Hans like lightning, illuminating a dark room. The 33 reasons America had won the war weren't military secrets or technological advantages. They were visible in every meal served, every kindness shown, every innovation deployed. America won because their system produced more food, more machines, more ideas, more hope than any nation in history. Free markets rewarded innovation instead of punishing it. Democratic debate prevented catastrophic mistakes that dictators made in isolation. Immigration brought the world's best minds to American shores. Education taught people to think instead of merely obey. Religious freedom allowed different groups to contribute their strengths instead of fighting over differences. Hans opened a small school in the ruins of his village, teaching children about the world beyond Germany's borders. He showed them maps of America's wheat fields, pictures of American cities untouched by war, stories of American freedoms that seemed impossible to German minds. These children would rebuild Germany using American ideas about human dignity and individual worth. Years later, when Germany had risen from its ashes to become a prosperous democracy, Hans would tell his own children about the Thanksgiving dinner that changed his life. "I went to America as a prisoner and came home as a free man," he would say, watching understanding dawn in their eyes. "Not because they released my body, but because they freed my mind from the prison of lies I didn't even know I was living in." The real victory hadn't been won on battlefields with guns and tanks. It had been won in mess halls with turkey dinners, in workshops with modern tools, in libraries with uncensored books. America's greatest weapon was the simple truth that human beings flourish when they are free to think, create, and choose their own destinies.